Well, I have with me this morning the free atlas that we got when we signed up for auto insurance. When was the last time you used one of these? Right? Students, if you don't know what this is, you can't talk to this like you can talk to Siri and say, Siri, I want to go visit Albuquerque. But of course, this is the book that's got all of the maps of all the main roads of not just America, or not just United States, this is North America. So anywhere that you want to go, presumably this atlas can take you there, or at least show you how to get there, get from point A to point B. So, now, of course, right, we just say, hey Siri, take me here, and you get the directions. But I have fond memories of family vacations growing up, of course. So we would have the atlas, and one of the things I just liked to do was follow along on our journey when we'd go on vacation. So kind of, see, okay, we're going by this town, here it is in the map, and just kind of, I don't know if you'd call that navigator or just, I was just interested in it. It was kind of a catch-22 for me because I get car sick when I read in the car, so I can really only do it in short spurts. I had to be careful with it. But in order to use these things, in order to use an atlas properly, there's really two pieces of information that you have to have. All right, two pieces. Anybody want to shout out what they think one of those might be? Yeah, I've heard them both. So you need to know where you are. You need to know where you're starting from. And you got to know where you're going. You got to know what that final destination is. So it's pretty basic, right? And so then once you have those two things, now this becomes useful. If you're missing either one of those two things, this atlas really won't be a lot of help to you. If you're not sure where you are, it doesn't really matter where you're going because you're not going to be able to use this to get there. And if you don't know where you're going, you know where you are, but you don't know where you're going, then what point is this either? So you've really got to have both of those two things. Once you know them, then of course this atlas becomes useful. Well, this morning in our series, we're continuing in the I Am series that we're going through, looking at these different statements that Jesus made in the Gospel of John. And this morning we get to John 14:6 that Pastor Tim already read for us, where he said, I am the way and the truth and the life. And so we're going to look at that statement this morning, but really before we do, we want to understand what was going on when Jesus spoke those words. I mean, the truth of that verse by itself is pretty apparent when Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. You can take that verse out of context, and the meaning is still there in what Jesus is saying. But I think when we take that verse and put it in the context and look at what is going on, what conversation Jesus was having with his disciples when he made that statement, there's just some new color and some new depth to it that can really cause it to hit home. And so that's what we're going to attempt to do this morning. So if you were following along in John chapter 14 and you're still open there in your Bibles, I want you to look back to John chapter 13. Because this, John chapter 13, is really where this whole conversation kind of begins with Jesus and the disciples. So the setting for this passage is in the upper room. So it is the night that Jesus will be arrested. It is the night before his crucifixion, the next morning. He's in the upper room with his disciples. It's where John records for us that Jesus washed his disciples' feet. It's where Jesus reveals that Judas will be the one who betrays him. But before even any of that, look at verse 1 of John chapter 13. There's a couple important details that John communicates to us here. So in verse 1, he tells us first off, he says it was just before the Passover festival. So the tradition of the Passover feast, when it's laid over top everything that's going to take place in the next 24 hours or so of Jesus' life, it just gives such depth and understanding to all that was taking place there. So John wants to make sure that us as readers, we know that it's Passover time. The Passover festival is just about to take place. Things are going to match up with what's going to happen in Jesus' life. But the other detail is what I really want to focus on this morning. John goes on and he says in verse 1, Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. That's really what we want to take out of this first verse. Jesus knew that he was returning to the Father. And because John communicates that to us as the reader, we know that as well. So Jesus knows he's going to the Father. We know that he is soon going back to the Father. But the disciples, as we're going to see, weren't quite catching on to that right away. Jesus had talked about it before. It's not the first time he brought it up. But that's not on the forefront of the disciples' mind, as we'll see. So we know what's going on, but the disciples just aren't quite making that connection yet. So John goes on there in chapter 13. For the next 30 verses, he records all of what I just said earlier about the Last Supper that took place with Jesus and the disciples. He records Jesus washing their feet. He records Jesus telling Judas that you will betray me. And then we get to, you see in verse 30 there, it says that Judas left. So after Judas had taken the bread, he went out, and it was night. So Judas is gone. When we pick things up here in verse 31 of John 13, Judas has already left. It's Jesus and the remaining 11 disciples. And it was at this point that Jesus really begins to explain to the disciples that he is leaving, that he is going back to the Father. So look what he says here in verse 31. It says, when he was gone, that's Judas, when Judas was gone, Jesus said, now the Son of Man is glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will glorify the Son in himself, and he will glorify him at once. My children, I will be with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and just as I told the Jews, so I tell you now, where I am going, you cannot come. A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. So Jesus begins this statement in the first two verses there, 31 and 32. He's talking about one of his purposes on the earth being to glorify God, to bring glory to the Father. So if we stop right there for just a moment, why was that one of Jesus' purposes? Why did he come to bring glory to the Father? And another word for glory might be to magnify the Father or make famous the Father. Why? Why was that one of the things that Jesus came to do? I mean, we can't forget that Jesus has said his journey, he's going back to the Father. That is the journey that he is on. And what we're going to find out shortly is that the Father wasn't just Jesus' destination, but that it was the destination for his followers as well. So Jesus is going back to the Father, but eventually his followers will go back to the Father as well. Now, if you think back to the atlas my family used on summer vacations, it wasn't this one, but like this one, right? We took a journey to a specific destination, but why, right? I mean, there's quite literally I don't know what the cutoff is for how big the town has to be to put it in here, but nearly every town in the country is listed in here. So when we set out on vacation, why was our destination? Why that place and not something else, someplace else? And it always had to do with there's something that draws you to the destination, isn't there? That's why it's your destination. There's something that draws you there. So if you go to Mount Rushmore, you're drawn by this work of art on the hillside, on the mountainside. If you go to Disney World, you're drawn there because that's where Mickey Mouse is, right? If you go to Arizona or Texas or Florida for the winter, you're drawn there typically by the warm weather. The destination is the destination because something draws us to it. So if we're going to take a journey to a destination, there's got to be something that draws us there. If we are going to follow Jesus in his journey to the Father, which, by the way, I think is one way you can describe the entire Bible, our journey back to the Father. So if we are going to follow Jesus on that journey, there needs to be something that draws us to the Father, to the destination. So that's why Jesus sought to bring glory to the Father. He sought to magnify the Father and make him famous so that we would be drawn to him. Right? Jesus sought to glorify God as the almighty, sovereign maker of heaven and earth, giver of all life. Why wouldn't we want to take that journey there, to be in that Father's presence? So Jesus sought to glorify the Father that we might be drawn to the Father. And we can see God's glory in lots of different ways. You can see it in creation. You can see it in other people as they live out the image of God within them. But really, there is no clearer, there is no brighter display of the Father's glory than Jesus. There just isn't. He most clearly displays God's glory. And of course, one of his purposes in that was that we might be drawn to the Father. So after he states that he's glorifying the Father in himself, right, he goes on to say then that he is completing this journey back to the Father. He says, I'm only going to be with you a little while longer. And then what Jesus says is where he was going, the disciples cannot come. He tells them that in verse 33. That is quite the statement if you think about it, because the last 3 years of the disciples' lives, what have they been doing? They've been following Jesus. I mean, that was the essence of being a disciple. You would give up everything and follow your rabbi. So for 3 years, they've been following Jesus. I mean, and what were the very words that Jesus said when he called them? He said, "Come, follow me." So for 3 years, this has been the disciples' life. And in essence, Jesus now says to them, "Oh, can't follow me. I'm going to leave pretty soon, and you can't follow me. Where I'm going, you cannot come." This is a major shift. This is a major life change for the disciples at this point. Now, what we're going to soon find out is that the disciples couldn't follow Jesus yet. And we'll get into that shortly. But for right now, Jesus says, you cannot come where I am going. And then, as Jesus prepared to depart, he gives them the new command in verses 34 and 35. Right, these instructions are so important that Christians ever since have been modeling their lives after these words of Jesus, talking about, as I have loved you, love one another. Everyone will know you're my disciples if you love one another. You know, these words ought to be at the core of every Christian in every church, in every part of the world, and every point of history. There's probably nothing more tweetable that Jesus ever said than that, right? And then Peter, right? You got to love Peter. Peter, even after that statement from Jesus, Peter's still hung up on what Jesus said before. So look at verse 36, what he says. Simon Peter asked him, "Lord, where are you going?" Where are you going? I mean, forget the wonderful command Jesus just said about loving everyone, and that's how they'll know you're my disciples. No, Jesus, where are you going? Why can't I come? What's going on? Jesus? And of course, Jesus answers. It says, Jesus replied, "Where I am going, you cannot follow now, but you will follow later." So Jesus says kind of the same thing as before, but he adds a little bit to it. This time he says, well, so right now you can't come, but you will come later. Surely that's enough for Peter, right? Sure, okay, Jesus, I can't follow you now, but we'll come later. That's good enough. Okay, Jesus. Well, not quite. That's not quite enough to satisfy Peter's questions there. Verse 37, Peter asked, "Lord, why can't I follow you now?" Right? Every parent of a toddler knows how that works. You know, we'll go later. Well, why can't we do it now, right? "Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." I mean, Peter ups the ante. Jesus, come on. I'll lay down my life for you. Why can't I follow you? And Jesus answered, verse 38, "Will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. So, I mean, Peter thinks he's catching on to things. So he doesn't quite know where Jesus is going, but he's picturing somewhere dangerous. Because he says, I'm willing to lay my life down for you, Jesus. So I don't know if Peter had in mind the crucifixion. I don't know if he had the cross in mind. Jesus has talked about it before, about how he was going to die. So maybe Peter has that in mind. Maybe Peter is thinking about a revolution, that he's picturing Jesus overthrowing the Romans and setting up his kingdom on earth. I'm not quite sure which one Peter is picturing, but both of them include violence. And Peter says, it doesn't matter, I'm going to give my life for you, Jesus. But the thing is, the final destination was not overthrowing Rome. And the final destination wasn't even the cross, right? Remember, Jesus said, I am going to the Father. That's where Jesus is going when he tells Peter and the disciples, you cannot come there. You cannot come now. You'll come later. He's going to the Father, and they cannot come. Now, the cross was part of that journey, but the cross wasn't the final destination. It was going back to the Father. The Father was the final destination. And at that point in time, there was no way for the disciples to take that journey to the Father. They were sinful human beings, every one of the disciples. And if the entire Old Testament tells us anything, it's that sinful human beings cannot stand in the presence of our holy God the Father. I mean, the Old Testament law revealed to the people that God was a holy God. The laws and commands weren't just simply rules to follow. They were a revelation of who God is. They were a revelation of the truth of God's character. Now, they showed the people what holiness looked like, what a holy God looked like. And so, if the people could have upheld the law and if they could have followed it completely, then there would have been no need for any of the animal sacrifices that took place in the temple. But as it was, the temple was a very busy place because nobody could uphold that entire law. And there were consistently sacrifices being offered in the temple. And even the temple itself, the temple housed the very presence of God himself, but that was still a reminder that God was holy and pure and the people were not. Because the people could never take that journey into the presence of the Father. They always had to stop short at the altar. And they offered their sacrifice, and they were never allowed to complete that journey, to go into the Father's presence. So even the temple is a reminder of the fact that the people are not worthy to stand before the Father. So when Peter asked the question in verse 37, Lord, why can't I follow you? The answer, Jesus could have just said, well, read back through your Old Testament, Peter. That's why you can't follow me, because you are not pure. You are not holy. You cannot stand before the Holy Father. I mean, what he goes on to say is, Peter, you're not even going to lay down your life for me. You're going to deny me 3 times. That's why you can't follow me. So if we recap up to this point, Jesus knew he was going to the Father. He had been glorifying the Father so that his followers would be drawn to the Father as well. But the problem was, no matter how much the people stood in awe of the Father as he was glorified before them, they were not able to take the journey into the Father's presence because of their own sinfulness. Now, Jesus gave them a sliver of hope in verse 36. He says, you cannot follow now, but you'll follow later. So there was a sliver of hope there, but up to that point, the situation was pretty depressing because the people could not take that journey. It's no wonder in verse 1 of chapter 14 that Jesus had to tell them not to let their hearts be troubled, because that's a troubling thing, that Jesus is returning to the Father and his closest disciples can't even take that journey with him at this point. But let's go on and see what Jesus says here. So moving into chapter 14, he said in verse 1, do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I am going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am. You know the way to the place I am going. So Jesus didn't just tell them not to be troubled. He actually went on to give them a few more details about what was taking place, so they'd kind of have something tangible to put their hope in. And so what he says then is, when we read verse 2 and it talks about Jesus preparing a room in the Father's house, we really have to understand that statement in light of first century the first century culture there. And it really doesn't help us when some translations use the word mansions, right? That Jesus is preparing mansions for us, because as American Christians, what do when we hear the word mansions? We picture this gigantic house up on a hill, immaculate garden, orchard of apple trees. Mine would have a 9-hole golf course in the backyard. I mean, that's what we picture, right? Let's be honest. When we read mansions, that we picture that kind of thing. That is not at all the picture that Jesus is trying to paint for us. I'm not saying mansions is the wrong word to use. I'm just saying that as Americans, we picture something vastly different than what Jesus was trying to paint here. So in that region in Galilee, at the time of Jesus, there were these large multi-room houses called insula. And archaeologists have discovered these things. It's not just from recorded history. They've found these actual things in the Middle East. So when we think of a family house today, we might think of a 2-story house, right, with, mom, dad, 2.4 children, a dog in the backyard. We kind of have this picture. And this house is basically the home where the children are raised and then move out to begin their own household. At least that's what every parent of teenagers hopes, right? That the kids will move out and form their own household. But in Jesus' day, that wasn't what happened. That wasn't what happened. In the middle of these insula, there was this courtyard in the very middle, and around the courtyard were kind of clusters of buildings or rooms where not just parents and kids lived, but grandparents, cousins, aunts, uncles, other family members, that they all lived in this insula. And when a son would reach the age of adulthood and prepare to take a wife, he would not typically leave and go start his own insula. What would happen is he would leave his engaged wife for a time, and he would return to the insula of his childhood, of his upbringing, and he would he would build kind of a new room or a new dwelling on that insula. And then when it was done, he would go back, he would get his fiancée, and then when they were married, they would come and live in the insula, in this new room that had been built for them. I mean, he would literally add a new room to his father's household, is what was taking place. So the purpose wasn't to create some luxury condo that was fit for royalty like we think of when we hear mansions. The purpose was to create a place where the newlyweds could live and be incorporated into the daily life, into the fellowship of the family, of the father's family. It was the father's house. And so Jesus isn't talking about a mansion on a hilltop when he says, I go to prepare a place or a room or a mansion for you. He was referencing this reality of daily life in Galilee. He was telling his disciples that he was going to leave them for a little while, but in doing so, he was going to his Father's house to prepare a place for them. And then his promise was that he would return, just as the son would go back to his soon-to-be wife and would take them. Jesus is saying, I will return and take you, and you will be with me where I am. And Jesus already said where he was going to be is the Father. Go back to the Father's presence. Jesus would come back and take them there. On their own, the disciples could not go to the Father's presence. Remember, they were sinful human beings. They were far from holy and pure. But through Jesus and what he would soon accomplish through his death on the cross, through his resurrection, the disciples would be able to take that journey to the Father. Jesus would be able to take them. Seems like that should have cleared things up, right? I mean, Jesus, he paints this picture for the disciples that surely would have answered all those questions about where he was going and what he was doing and coming back to take them with him. And because they were sinful, the disciples couldn't go, so Jesus will come back. It seems like that just should have answered all the questions. But apparently there's still some confusion, because in verse 5, Thomas asks this question. So verse 5, it says, Thomas said to him, Lord, we don't know where you are going, so how can we know the way? If I can steal a move from my son Levi real quick. Right? It's like, I mean, that's how I would have responded to Thomas. Jesus, however, has got some more patience than I apparently would have, and goes on to explain some more. But apparently that previous explanation, that illustration, didn't quite hit home, and so Jesus is about to get almost as simple as he can be in answering this question. He is going to sum up the entire dialogue in a very concise way, and that is our I am statement for this morning, right? We finally got to it. We finally get to this I am statement. So in verse 6, Jesus says, and he's answering Thomas here, he says, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you really knew me, you will know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. So the whole discussion up to this point, it's been about a journey from point A to point B. So point A is the sinful, unholy state that every human being finds themselves in apart from Christ. And point B is the presence of the holy, pure Father. And what Jesus is saying is, it is all about me. It is all about me. He says, I'm the truth. I'm the one who reveals the Father to you. I'm glorifying God before you. And what happens is the more we recognize the holiness of God and the glory of God, the more we look inward at ourselves and see, there's something lacking here. I'm not holy like God is. And so as Jesus reveals the truth about the Father, he also reveals the truth about us. He points out to us that we are at point A. Remember, that's one of the requirements we said to take a journey with an atlas. You got to know where you are. And Jesus proclaimed the truth. He shows us clearly that we are at point A. We are not in the Father's presence. We are sinful. We are unholy. There needs to be a change there. But then he also says, I am the life. He goes on in a few verses to say, I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. He's saying, I am the God of life, through whom all life is given, through whom life is sustained. He's almost saying, I'm the destination as well. I'm not just the truth that shows you where you are. I'm the destination for where you want to be. I am the destination just like the Father is. And then he says as well, I am the way. I am the way to get from point A to point B. I am the way to get from the sinful, unholy state that everyone is currently in to being with the Father, being in the Father's presence. We can't get to point B on our own. Jesus says, I am the way. I pave the way and will take you to that destination, to the Father. And really from that point on, when Jesus makes that statement, it's only a matter of hours. Only a matter of hours before Jesus would sort of finish paving the way to the Father from point A to point B. Through his death and resurrection, finally and ultimately, he would provide that way to move from point A to point B, from sinfulness and unholiness into the presence of the Father. But what Jesus says is, I am the way. I am the only way. And so the question for us then is where are we on that journey? Where are we on that journey? We said the thing about a map, before you can go somewhere, you have to know where you are. You have to know where you are. So the question for us is, do we know that apart from Jesus, we are at point A? Do we know that apart from Jesus, we are sinful and unholy? If you're not quite sure whether or not that is true, I have an assignment for you this week. You can Google all 613 laws of the Old Covenant and see if you're able to uphold every single one of them for the next week. Just give it a try. Remember, these laws reveal the truth about who God is. They reveal God's character and his holiness. And so if you break any one of those laws in the next week, then that's the answer. You are at point A. You are sinful and unholy. And if you go a whole week and you don't think you broke any one of them, your next assignment is to read Matthew 5 through 7 and see if Jesus agrees with you that you didn't break any of them. But it's vital. It's vital that we know where we are, that we understand our present state apart from Christ. I mean, Jesus said, I am the truth. And so we must see the truth about who God is, but also about who we are and about where we are apart from him. So if you do know you're at point A and you desperately want to get to the Father's presence at point B, then I urge you to hear Jesus' words this morning when he says, I am the way. I am the way. No one comes to the Father except through me. I mean, Jesus paved the way for us. It's only through our acceptance of his death and resurrection that we are able to be purified of our sinfulness and our unholiness. I mean, we are made righteous in him so that we can stand in the Father's presence. And he is the only way. The fun thing about an atlas is once you know your current location and once you know where you are going, with an atlas, there are actually any number of ways to get there. I mean, the possibilities really are endless. So I was thinking, what's a fun destination I might like to take? Well, the Major League Baseball All-Star Game has always intrigued me. So if I wanted to go to the All-Star Game this summer in Washington, D.C., I know where I am. I'm in Eureka. If I know where I want to go, Washington, D.C., I can open this up and find a way to get there. So if I want to take the most efficient, quickest route possible, then I'd hop on I-74 and I'd go to Indianapolis. I'd get on I-70 and it'd take you basically the rest of the way. But that's not the only way to go, right? Maybe I think, let's make this a baseball trip, and I want to swing down through Louisville and go to the Louisville Slugger Museum. I could do that. I could say, I'm going to be pretty close to the Ark Encounter in Williamstown, Kentucky. Maybe I can work that into my trip. Or interstate driving is just so boring. I'm going to take 2-lane roads the entire way. I'm going to really see America. I mean, the possibilities are endless. There's so many roads in here that you can be taken. But when it comes to the journey from our sinfulness to the Father's presence, there is not a multitude of ways. I mean, Jesus said, I am the way. It's not like an atlas in that regard. So there's no route that goes through Good Worksville on the way to the Father. There just isn't. There's no moral living burg that you go through. There's not some, any religion will get you there highway. There's none of that. It is Jesus saying, I am the way. I am the only way into the Father's presence. That's exclusive. I mean, that is an exclusive claim that Jesus makes. Just like a couple weeks ago when Jesus said that I am the gate into the sheep pen. I mean, it's just as exclusive here. Jesus says, I am the way to the Father. So if we want to dwell in God's presence for all eternity, which is what we are created to do. If we want to do that, then Jesus is the only way to the destination. And he loved us so much that he's willing to pay the high price so that we can take that journey, that we can move from point A to point B. And he loved us so much to do that. And that's the very love that Jesus talked about earlier in chapter 13 when he says, love one another, that, as I have loved you, love one another. That's how everyone will know you're my disciples, if you love one another. That's the kind of love that Jesus is talking about. And I love you so much that I'm going to make a way for you to get from where you are in your sinfulness to the presence of the Father. And then as his followers, we are called to display that as well. And in a way, glorify God in the process. Make God famous in the process, that others might be drawn to that same destination that we've been drawn to. So would you stand with me this morning as we prepare to close in prayer? God, we come to you this morning, and I guess I can only speak for myself, that apart from you, I am most definitely at point A. I'm sinful and unholy and not worthy to stand in your presence. But God, we give you praise that you loved us so much that you sent your Son, that he would do what was necessary to purify us from that sinfulness and that unholiness, that unrighteousness. God, I thank you that we can move to point B, which is you, your presence. And God, the fact that you say that there's only one way to get there, I pray that we would not shy away from that claim, God, but that we would hear the truth in that claim, that we would stand firm on that truth, and that we would trust you in it. That if you say that you are the only way to the Father, that we would believe it, and that we would live that out, that we would not be timid in speaking that into our world, God, communicating that truth. God, I pray that your love for us would overwhelm us, as we sang about earlier, that we would be overwhelmed by you, that it would just pour out from us, that all men would know that we are your disciples based on our love. And so, God, we thank you for that. We thank you that you paved the way for us, that you prepare a place for us in the Father's house, and that you take us to be there with you. God, we so look forward to that day. We get glimpses of it here, but we so look forward to that day of being in your presence for all eternity, free from sin and pain and suffering. We give you praise for that, and it's in your name we pray. Amen. So